Afternoon, folks. Hope everybody is doing well. This is going to be our first lesson on animal nervous systems. If you are in my bio class, you should probably go onto the Blackboard site and get the notes for this section so that you have something to follow along with as we are proceeding. All right, now we've dealt with the basics of animal body plans, animal development, organ systems, and so forth. Are one of the things that pretty much every animal is going to require, with the exception, of course, of our sponges, which, as always, being the outliers to almost everything in the kingdom Animalia, don't have organ systems, is that whatever other organ systems your animal's got, it's going to need some way of controlling itself. That the animal is going to need some method of regulating how its own body works. Animals rely on control systems as a mechanism for basically making sure that all their other parts are going to do what they need to do when they need to do them. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of control systems that animals utilize. We have endocrine systems, we have nervous systems. Now, both of these act to manipulate things going on in the body, but they do it in different ways. Your endocrine systems are going to be controlling via chemical means. They operate by means of hormone signals that are being distributed throughout the body primarily by the bloodstream. Whereas your nervous systems operate via electrical signals, sending coded impulses along nerves to transmit information from one body part to another. Endocrine systems, you're going to find, are relatively slow acting. I mean, some endocrine responses can be relatively rapid, but as compared to nerve impulses, chemical signals travel much more slowly. They can only go at the speed of the bloodstream, carrying them around to different parts of the body, whereas a nerve impulse can travel at the speed of an electrical signal. So in general, the nervous system is much faster to react. Now you'll find that endocrine systems are also slower to adapt the nervous responses. That takes a little bit longer for them to ramp up, but once they ramp up, they tend to continue going for a while. They tend to continue with their effects for some time. As long as that hormone is in circulation, then the effect continues to happen. By contrast, nerve responses are quick. They're things that happen really swiftly. Signal goes, out, it's done. If you want to keep on having that stimulus, you need to keep on sending more signals. But every individual nerve impulse is quickly resolved. And finally, when we're thinking about how all this works, your endocrine signals tend to be very widespread. The hormone can travel anywhere in the body that the bloodstream can carry it, which means that any cell that has the right receptor for that hormonal signal can potentially be responding to it. So you'll find that oftentimes endocrine effects are systemic, that they have widespread consequences throughout the body. For the most part, nervous responses are targeted, that rather than having a single signal that goes out to all parts of the body at once, your nervous system responses are typically directed to a specific thing, saying, okay, we're going to move that muscle, we're going to stimulate that gland, we're going to close these eyes. You're not going to be having a single widespread systemic signal all at once. And finally, in terms of centralization, endocrine systems tend to be decentralized. That is, endocrine glands are found throughout the body. It is a system in name, not in terms of structure. Its parts are not all unified. By contrast, nervous systems tend to be interconnected. There is an exception that I'll get to shortly, but in general, when you've got a nervous system, its parts are connected and very often centralized for central command and control. So we got two basic ways of regulating bodies: endocrine, chemical regulation, and nervous, electrical regulation. But ultimately, of the two, the nervous system is going to be the superior one. Superior in the sense that the endocrine system is in many ways subordinate to it. Endocrine responses are in some cases auto-regulating. Some hormones are secreted in response to things happening within a tissue without the brain having to send any kind of stimulus at all. But the brain is capable of intervening to stimulate glands and tell them do or don't do a thing. So broadly speaking, you're going to find that of the two control systems, the nervous system is going to be the one in charge. Fundamentally, nervous systems have, and that's where really our attention is going to go right now. I may not get to endocrine systems in this class. They're highly variable between different groups of animals, but there are several trends in nervous systems that we can encounter. So let's take a look at that. Let's start taking a look at how animal nervous systems are put together, how they evolve, and how they differ from one group of animals to another. Broadly speaking, all your nervous systems have three basic things that they do. One, gather information, sensory inputs. Nervous systems fundamentally can't do their work unless they are collecting data, unless they are gathering information about the environment in which the organism lives. So first and foremost function of the nervous system is to collect information. This is going to involve sometimes free nerve endings that respond to stimuli. Sometimes this is going to involve specialized sensory receptors or organs, like the structures of the inner ear that detect sound, or the retina of the eye, which are specialized to gather particular kinds of data. So nervous systems collect information. That information is then routed to central processing units. Second phase of nervous activity is integration. Integration function is quite simply taking the data that we have gathered, putting it together, comparing it with other data and previous experience, and making a determination about what, if anything, needs to be done about it. Integration is normally carried out by central structures in the nervous system. Typically that means the brain and the spinal cord. And finally, we have motor outputs. Motor output means that the central structures that do the processing, having arrived at a decision, are going to issue commands. They're going to send signals out away from the brain and or spinal cord to the rest of the body, stimulating parts of your body to act in response to the data that was processed. Any structure that is responding to the nervous system is called an effector. E-F-F-E-C-T-O-R. Effectors are any structures that carry out nervous system responses. Effectors come in two basic flavors in our bodies. Effectors can be muscles, or effectors can be glands. And you'll find almost everything that happens in your body is the result of either telling a muscle to move or telling a gland to secrete something. So those are our three basic kinds of things the nervous system does. Within those broad headings, we have a lot of different kinds of things happening, though. Sensory input includes everything from tasting your food, to smelling odors in the air, to watching an object move across your field of vision, to monitoring your blood pressure. Integration includes cognition, the actual thought narrative. It includes comparison and contrast. It includes linguistic processing. It includes memory. A lot of things involved there. And finally, motor output can be anything from stimulating your thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone to telling your muscles to jerk your hand away from a hot stove. So basically all of our other bodily activities are fundamentally dependent on that nervous stimulus. There are certainly parts of the body that are auto-regulating, that do their own thing in response to mechanical stretch or in response to local chemical signaling or what have you. But in general, you're going to see that the nervous system and its responses are going to characterize almost everything that we do. So, how do we get a nervous system? Let's take a look at the kinds of nervous systems we see in various animals. Now, the simplest animals of all, your sponges, have no nervous system. Every cell in a sponge is pretty much doing its own thing. There is some local chemical signaling. Cells send out chemical signals to other nearby cells. We call that paracrine, P-A-R-A-C-R-I-N-E signaling, as opposed to endocrine, E-N-D-O-C-R-I-N-E. But a sponge does not have a central processor, nor does it have a network of nerves or other electrical signaling conduits to transmit data from one part of its body to another. Sponges lack other complex organ systems, so they don't really need anything to transmit data around from one part of their body or structure to another. Now, the simplest nervous systems are those found in cnidarians and in other radially symmetrical animals, and we call them nerve nets. a nerve net does not have a central processing. The nerve net instead is going to consist of a diffuse network of neurons, Neurons. Neurons are the cells of the nervous system, but it's going to consist of a network of neurons spread out throughout the animal's body walls. Nerve nets do not have a central processor. There's no equivalent of a brain in a jellyfish or a similar radially symmetrical animal. Rather, the nerve net is capable of carrying out only very simple responses, basically contracting and relaxing of the body wall. Typically, that means that the range of responses that your jelly or other cnidarian is limited to basically comes down to very simple responses to tactile stimuli. Move towards food or warmth. Move away from cold or noxious chemicals. Curl tentacles upward towards the mouth to pull in food. That's about the range of what you can do as a cnidarian. You're basically just responding to the most fundamental mechanical and sensory stimuli in your environments. Some cnidarians have simple eyes that are light receptive patches which allow them to move around in the water column to deeper or shallower water in response to changing light levels. But in general, you will find that a nerve net provides only the most basic kinds of responses. Now let's get a little bit more complex. Nerve nets have just scattered neurons all throughout. Individual neurons, every cell for itself. They pass on signals to other nearby neurons in kind of a wave moving across the animal's body, sort of spreading them out in a very diffuse fashion. There's not a dedicated pathway. But once we get into more complex animals, we begin seeing structures called nerves. A nerve is a structure that is essentially a cord of nervous tissue, capable of conducting signals along a dedicated pathway, sending stimulus from point A to point B. Now, nerves happen before the evolution of central nervous systems. The simplest kinds of nervous systems beyond a nerve net are going to involve nerve fibers connecting groups of neurons. Basically, what you have are localized nerve nets that are all responsive to the same set of stimuli, because the stimulus that begins in one place is then passed on to dedicated other spots. This allows somewhat more complex coordination of bodily movements. A lot of nervous systems of this kind feature what's called a nerve ring, and the nerve ring is going to be a circular band of nervous tissue, usually somewhere around the mouth of the animal, that has a number of radiating nerves coming off it, and each of those radiating nerves attached to a localized nerve net. So if I can sketch you a real quick diagram right here. I'm going to draw an example of an animal with a nerve ring. Best example of that is going to be our starfish, members of the phylum Echinodermata. And you will see that in this echinoderm cross-section that I am drawing for you here, that I have that centralized ring of nervous tissue with nerve cords reaching out from it into the animal's arms, and then smaller nerve nets attached to them. This allows complex coordination of activities. That the nerve ring is not quite the same thing as a processing center, not in the same way that a brain is, but what the nerve ring does allow us to do is to coordinate the actions of multiple parts of the body at once. There's communication between the animal's various limbs, and that allows the starfish to move its body in more directed ways, to direct more than one limb to help it climb over a rock, or to move towards a specific prey in the environment, or to grab hold of food with two limbs at once. This allows the animal a broader range of adaptive responses to the environment. However, still not all that complex, and it's still largely limited to our radially symmetrical forms of life. Once you get into a bilaterian, once you get into bilaterally symmetrical animals, you're going to need a much more complex range of responses. Bilaterally symmetrical animals have a distinct front and back. They have to be able to navigate directionally through an environment. They have to be able to move toward and away from things that they want in a much more controlled fashion. They have to coordinate their body parts in much more sophisticated patterns. This means more data processing capability is needed. So we're going to find that our animals with a nerve net or nerve ring not up to that. Instead, bilaterians are going to get two major developments that with more complexity, two big things you're going to see. One is you're going to see a thing that we mentioned previously in an earlier chapter called cephalization. C-E-P-H-A-L-I-Z-A-T-I-O-N. Cephalization from the prefix ceph, C-E-P-H, means head. Cephalization is the development of an anterior head, having a structure at the anterior end of the body, or the superior end in our case, in which you've got a concentration of nervous tissue and specialized sensory organs. When an animal has an inherent directionality to its body plan, which is lacking in our radially symmetrical animals, having sensory organs located at the front is going to be a very convenient place to put them. Think about it this way. It would not be quite as convenient for your body's navigation and movement around if your eyes are located in your knees. Think about a dog that has its head pointing straight forward with the body, and that's how most quadrupedal animals are going to have it. Having the major sensory organs located at the front, as it were, gives the animal the widest range of ability to navigate in its environment effectively and be aware of the things right in front of it. Sorry, folks, some allergies. Now, coming with cephalization is going to be the development of a more complex sort of nervous system, a centralized nervous system. Centralized nervous systems are divided into two basic parts. First off, you have the central nervous system, or CNS for short. The central nervous system is going to consist of all those parts involved in the processing and integration. The central nervous system takes in the data from the rest of the body, processes that data, makes instructions, sends out the commands. Central nervous system typically is accompanied by a concentration of nervous tissue inside the head, which we would think of as a brain. Also associated with our central nervous system, we will typically find one or more nerve cords, C-O-R-D-S cords here. Nerve cords are thick bands of nervous tissue that extend away from the brain and travel down the length of the body. In some animals with a centralized nervous system, there is one nerve cord. In some, there are two. Most species have a single nerve cord, which in us we would think of as the spinal cord. The central nervous system is where the processing happens. It's also the broadcast point for all the instructions. I should point out those nerve cords, you may not realize it, are actually processing centers too. Your spinal cord makes certain decisions for you. Your spinal cord, among other things, is involved in deciding about reflex arcs. Whenever you reflexively jerk your hand back from a hot stove or something else painful, your spinal cord made that decision before the brain was even informed about it. You might realize, that you don't have to think about pulling your hand back because the signal has not even gotten to your brain yet. Your brain gets that data after the fact. Likewise, the spinal cord is involved in a lot of the basic decision-making involving instinctive regulations of parts in the lower body, urination, defecation, orgasm. The spinal cord is going to be handling a lot of that sort of stuff. And it doesn't necessarily consult the brain before it does. Our brains can, to a certain extent, step in to regulate what the spinal cord is doing, but the spinal cord is also a decision-making center. Now, the rest of the nervous system is going to be a peripheral nervous system, P-E-R-I-P-H-E-R-A-L, peripheral. The peripheral nervous system is going to consist of all of those parts involved in either collecting data and sending it to the central nervous system, or in carrying commands from the central nervous system out to the body. So input or output. Peripheral nervous system is going to include nerves, which are those cords of nervous tissue that I mentioned earlier, Some of them are going to radiate directly from the brain. Some of them are going to radiate from the nerve cords. You're also going to have sensory receptors as part of our peripheral nervous system. Some of these are going to be dedicated sense organs, like the retina of the eye or the olfactory membrane of the nose. Others of them are going to be simply receptors attached to nerve endings, or in some cases, free nerve endings themselves. And finally, you're going to occasionally find clusters of nervous tissue outside the CNS, which act as relay points for signals. Those are called ganglia. Ganglia. If you're talking about just one of them, it is a ganglion. 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 So your ganglia are basically going to be clusters of neurons located outside the CNS. Signals come into them from a bunch of points and gets radiated from there to where they need to go next. A lot of ganglia are associated with nerve plexi, Plexi, singular form plexus, Plexus. Plexi are going to be basically networks of nerves around a structure. For example, there are a lot of plexi around the digestive tract for controlling its complex actions. Ganglia can act basically as secondary points for signal transmission. You'll hear in some species about a quote-unquote second brain at the inferior end of the body. Like you might hear, they often say in some dinosaurs there was a quote-unquote second brain at the base of the tail. What they're really talking about there was a large ganglion, a large clump of nervous tissue that acts as a secondary relay point for rapid collection of data from the lower part of the body and transmission to the upper part of the body. It's not really a brain as we would think of it. So that's the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. So central nervous system, brain, nerve cords, does the processing and integration tasks. Peripheral nervous system, nerves, sensory receptors and organs, and ganglia carry out the sensory input tasks, delivering data to the CNS, and the motor output tasks, delivering instructions away from the CNS. That basic pattern is going to be the same in all animals that have a central nervous system. Now, I should point out, not all animals have this developed exactly the same way. Some animals have more than one nerve cord, some have just one. Some animals have a dorsal nerve cord that runs along the back of the body. Some have a ventral nerve cord that runs along the belly. If you don't know those terms, dorsal, D-O-R-S-A-L, means along the back or to the back. Ventral, V-E-N-T-R-A-L, means the front or the belly. So any structure that's on the front of your body is ventral. Any structure that's on the back of your body is dorsal. And so we, for example, as a vertebrate, all vertebrates have a dorsal nerve cord running along the back of the body, and all vertebrates have a well-developed brain. Not all animals have equally well-developed brains. Some have basically just a cluster of ganglia inside their head. Some have extremely complex brains with multiple distinct regions and a lot of different activities that they engage in at once. Now, this brings up a really important evolutionary point, and one of my favorite aspects of nervous system evolution is to think about why you have the nervous system that you do. Or more to put it another way, why do some animals have more brain than others? Not every animal is equally gifted in the brain department. Some animals are considerably smarter than other animals. Any of you who have spent any length of time around sheep knows that they are monumentally stupid animals. And we bred them for that. I'll talk about why in a moment. You don't expect an earthworm to be doing calculus. But by contrast, you expect certain animals to be pretty clever, right? You expect your chimpanzee, your dog, your horse, your gorilla, your dolphin. You expect all these critters to be able to learn a wide variety of tasks and to be pretty smart. But you don't expect any of them to be as smart as you. So the question we must put to ourselves is, why do some animals have more powerful brains than others? Why are some animals better at thinking than other animals? There are a couple of reasons for this. For starters, body plan complexity. If you have a very simple body plan, you don't need a lot of processing power. If you're a sponge, you don't really need a processor at all. You're a filter feeder. All you're really doing is sucking nutrients out of the environment around you and occasionally spewing your gametes to go fertilize other nearby sponges. That's it. You don't need a processor for that at all. If I am a cnidarian whose basic functions are drift around in the ocean till I bump into food and pull it into my mouth, hey, that's really not going to require a lot of extensive processing power either. If I am an earthworm and I am basically just burrowing through the soil, ingesting the dirt in front of me, sifting the nutrients out of it as they pass along my body length intestine, and excreting the castings at the other end, yeah, not much processing power required for that either. I don't need much more ability to do anything other than to eat and mate. So a big complex brain is not benefiting me a whole lot. It is hard for us to imagine because we are human, and as human beings, we have a very, very well-developed brain. It's right there in our name, Homo sapiens. Sapiens is for wisdom. Homo sapiens, the wise man. Our chief adaptation as a species is our intelligence. Think about it. You do not have claws. You do not have horns. You don't have big fangs. You don't have a thick hide. You don't have fur to protect you against the cold. You're slower than most things that would want to run you down and kill you. You're not super physically powerful. What you are good at is thinking. Homo sapiens, more than anything else, is an ape that has learned to outthink its environment. Our chief adaptation as a species is our ability to come up with clever solutions to our problems. Whether that is devising a way of stalking and sneaking up on our prey to kill them, whether that is thinking of technologies that we can use to manipulate the world to our benefit, whether that is developing complex social structures to allow us to coordinate our activities with one another. One way or another, Homo sapiens has elaborated our process of thinking more so than any other living animal. That's our chief adaptation as a species. So for us, it seems obvious that intelligence is a useful trait. And we would say, well, of course intelligence is a useful trait. Why would any animal not benefit from being smarter? It turns out not every animal benefits from being smart. Now, our intelligence is one of the chief ways in which we differ from other species. This thing we call intelligence, or sentience, or sapience, however you want to put it, is not a uniquely human quality. Let's put that right out there right now. You might think, okay, humans are the only intelligent animals. No, that is not true at all. Especially because intelligence is not an on-off switch. Intelligence is a spectrum. You got animals like ourselves at one end with really complex processors capable of doing a lot of really amazing cognitive activity. You got animals at the other end, like your cnidarians, that barely have cognition at all. But it's not one or the other. You got varying degrees in there. Certain animals are going to be smarter than others. You expect a dog to be able to learn to do more tricks than, I don't know, a lizard, you know. You expect your chimpanzee to be a much more clever tool user than, say, a pigeon. But let's think about the fact that, say, there are some tool users out there. Otters use tools. They use rocks to break open clamshells. Take some brains. A lot of birds use tools, using sticks to fish for insects in holes in the ground and so forth. It's not a uniquely human quality. A lot of the things we think of as uniquely human, empathy, cooperation, tool use, building shelters, even culture, are not all just human activities. We have evidence of cultural activities, of ritual activities among both crows and elephants, both of which incidentally bury their dead. When I say bury their dead, they have funerals for their dead. They have gatherings to mourn the ones that have fallen, and in particular, elephants actually leave offerings for their dead. They will put flowers and food near the bodies of their dead, which among other things suggests the possibility that elephants have a belief in an afterlife. So we might not even be able to say that religion is a uniquely human quality. Now, what makes the difference? Why are you clever? Why is a raccoon clever? And why is a cow not clever? And again, it's more than the other. Certain animals are going to be smarter than other animals. You'll probably agree that the chimpanzee is smarter than the dog, but the dog is probably smarter than the sheep, and the sheep is smarter than the bug, you know? What's going on here? There are several factors that play into whether or not a given species is going to find intelligence to be a chiefly important adaptation. 1. Diet. Diet might be the biggest one. If there's not an obvious connection here, let's consider the dietary needs of a wolf versus a deer. Deer eat plants, right? Leaves, grasses, things in the environment like that. Deer are dealing with a food supply that does not try to escape. Deer are dealing with a food supply that in most environments is pretty abundant. Assuming you're not in a drought or something, it's not all that hard for deer to find food. Therefore, a deer does not need a complex processor to acquire the food that it needs. Its diet is simple. It does not have to think of a strategy for sneaking up on grass. It does not have to look hither and yon and hunt carefully to locate edible plants in most cases. So for deer, excess energy spent on processing is extraneous. A complex brain weighs a lot. A complex brain requires a lot of nourishment. A complex brain draws a lot of energy. To put this in context, Homo sapiens, your brain at any given moment is requiring between 1/5 and 1/4 of all of your body's oxygen and glucose. 20 to 25% of your body's resources go just to powering this thing. That's a lot of energy to spare. So if you don't need it, why do it? Furthermore, the diet of a deer, mostly leaves, maybe some fruits now and again if they can get them, is mostly calorically not dense. The foods they eat have to be eaten in large bulk. They're not getting big boatloads of calories all at once. And their diet is almost exclusively plant material, which means that they're not getting a lot of proteins and lipids, mostly carbs in their diet, right? What this means in practical terms, folks, is that deer are going to often lack the energy resources to power a big brain, to grow a big brain. You need lots of lipids and proteins for that, or to need a big brain. Think about the needs of a deer in its environment. Move towards the food. Move towards another deer that you're either going to fight with or mate with. Run away from predators. That's about the extent of it. You don't need lots and lots of complex power to do that. So yeah, the deer is not going to have to be nearly as intelligent as the wolf. Now let's think about the wolf. The wolf is an obligate carnivore. The wolf needs to kill food that is trying not to be killed. The wolf, therefore, needs to outwit its dinner. The wolf needs to think of strategies to sneak up on the deer. The wolf needs to figure out strategies to head it off at the pass and ambush it when it tries to run away. The wolf needs to know where it can hide. The wolf needs to survey its environment and look for prey that is hiding. The wolf needs to integrate sense, visual, and auditory data to triangulate where the prey that it can't see in the forest might be located. Furthermore, the wolf is taking in more nutrients, and specifically, because it's a carnivore, more proteins and fats. It has more resources with which to grow a big, complex brain, and it needs much more processing power. In short, the wolf, because of its carnivorous diet, needs a better computer to do all the things involved in calculating when and where to leap, to figure out strategies for catching up with its prey, and basically it's going to need a lot of energy coming in to power that. So the carnivorous diet ends up impacting that as well. In short, my predatory animal needs a better brain. It needs more capability of figuring out the ways to get its food. So you're going to find that in general, all other things being equal, Carnivores and omnivores, organisms that have to hunt, are going to have more complex brains than most herbivores. They need more processors. That's one factor. How about environment? Not all environments are equally challenging. Some environments mean that you have more stuff that you have to do. They have more things that are going to be challenging to you. If I live in the grasslands, wide open plain, my environment does not offer me a lot of challenges. I don't have a lot of climbing to do. I don't have to navigate around fissures in the earth. I don't have to test my footing to make sure I don't fall off a cliff. I don't have to get around among trees. The plains are pretty straightforward. If I live in a forest, I have to navigate in an environment that's much more crowded. I have to be able to see and figure out what's going on between the trees and among the foliage. If I live in a hilly or mountainous environment, my world is now three-dimensional, and I have to consider data that help me to navigate safely along precipices and cliffs and edges and so forth. What do you expect to be smarter? Sheep or goats? I'm guessing you said goats. And any of you who ever lived on a farm know that goats are the troublemakers, right? Goats get into trouble because goats are clever and goats are curious and goats investigate things. Sheep are dumb. Sheep barely know which way is up. And I asked earlier, I said we bred sheep to be stupid. We did the same thing with cows. You know why? Because a smart sheep or a smart cow is trouble. Those are our meat animals. Those are animals that we want to hold still and cooperate with us so we can shear wool off of them or so we can kill them and eat them. We don't want them to be clever. A clever sheep doesn't help us in any way. We're not going to put it to work, but it can make trouble. And that's the thing. Complex environment versus simple environment. Sheep evolved on open grasslands. So did bison. So did cows. None of these animals are noted for their intelligence. Goats evolved in hilly and mountainous environments. They evolved in complex environments where they had to gauge, can I make that jump? Where they had to determine, is that safe footing? Where they had to figure out ways to navigate to a place they want to go when the terrain does not provide a nice, neat, straightforward path from point A to point B. My goat has a more complex environment to operate in, and therefore it needs a better processor. And that complex brain, incidentally, that means that you put that goat in a much simpler environment, like a farmyard. That goat's brain is going to look for things to do. That brain is going to become curious about things in the environment. It's going to look for occupation for itself. That animal's brain evolved to be processing a lot more data than it is when you take it off the mountain and put it on the barnyard. And therefore, goats make trouble because goats are curious, because goats have a processor that's looking for things to do. Finally, let's think about socialization. If I'm a solitary animal, I don't have to deal with other members of my species all that often. Most of my interactions are probably going to involve mating season. That is, figuring out who to mate with, maybe fighting off competing mates. That's about the extent of it. Maybe a bit of child rearing, depending on what species I am. But for the most part, if I'm a solitary animal, I don't need a lot of social behavior. I'm doing my own thing. Now let's suppose I am a group living animal. I'm a social animal. I live in a flock, or I live in a herd, or I live in other social groups in which the animals are adapted to work together. That part of their strategy for navigating the environment is cooperation. If I am a social animal, I need to read a lot more cues, much more than my asocial solitary animal that primarily needs to worry about, does this thing want to mate with me or not want to mate with me? Or is this thing fighting with me or not fighting with me? That's about the limits. But if I'm living in a social group, I got a lot more things to evaluate. Is my fellow ape angry with me? Is my fellow ape happy with the thing I just did? Is my fellow ape giving me a, come here, I want a mate signal? Is my fellow mate in pain or distress that I need to help with? Basically, you have a whole wide range of different responses and emotions that need to be processed in a cooperative group. You need a way of interpreting sounds. Is that a noise of distress? Is that a noise of happiness? Is that a noise of fear? All of that requires a much more sophisticated processor. Ergo, you're going to find that social animals, all other things being equal, tends to have more complex processing power. Does not always mean they do. Sheep arguably live in flocks. They're not terribly bright, but we've also bred them for stupidity. A smart sheep turns into lamb chops right away because we don't want it passing its genes on, because that would be inconvenient. So broadly speaking, social versus solitary animals, the social animal will usually have a more complex brain. Herbivores versus carnivores and omnivores, the herbivore will have the less complex brain. Simple terrain versus complex terrain. Complex terrain demands more from you. And these are the primary determinant factors. If you look at the adaptations of an animal, if you look at the environment that it lives in, the kind of diet that it has, and how it relates to other members of its own kind, you can get a pretty good sense of how smart that critter is likely to be. There are obviously weird exceptions here and there where animals are outsized intelligence or outsized stupid for their environment because they found other ways to adapt. But in general, it's a pretty good predictive model. Now, let's apply that lens to ourselves. Humans are social animals. We are adapted, like almost all primates, to live in cooperative groups. And therefore, we have to interpret a lot of different signals from our fellow apes about their state of information, their state of health, their emotional condition, and that sort of thing. Humans are omnivores. We are adapted to a diet that contains both plant and animal food products, and as such, killing some of our food and tracking it down becomes a really important part of our strategy. We are hunter-gatherers. We need to hunt, and we need to also figure out what food is good to gather. Our food processing strategy involves a lot of thinking. And finally, humans are going to be living in complex environments. Now, you as a human living in modern civilization in a world that is surrounded by, flashing lights and noises and complex demands of jobs and classes you have to go to and all that sort of thing, that means that humans, by and large, have a lot of demands. Now, your ancestors didn't have that many demands. Our ancestors were savanna-dwelling hunter-gatherers. They were living in wide-open plains environments, which means less complex terrain, but at the same time, our ancestors were still cooperating. They still had the cooperation factor and the social factor involved. And your primate ancestors, our early human ancestors, inherited some pre-developed brain complexity from our primate forebears. I mean, you're a primate too, but primates as a group tend to be clever. Why? Because primates evolved as arboreal animals. If you don't remember that word, A-R-B-O-R-E-A-L, arboreal. Arboreal means tree dwelling. Your ancestors evolved in the complex 3D environment of the treetop canopy. They had to gauge, okay, is that branch safe to bear my weights? How far is that jump from point A to point B? What's the easiest pathway for me to climb on to get to that fruit up there? You have to be able to navigate in 3 dimensions, not just 2, where you can climb up, down, left, right, whatever. In short, that's a complex world. So primates have omnivorous diet, complex environment, and social behavior. And therefore, you're going to find that in general, the order Primates has involved a very high degree of intelligence. Homo sapiens, since we have dispensed with a lot of the toolkits that our ancestors possessed, we've lost the fur, we've lost the big teeth, we've lost the claws. We've had little choice but to enhance what we do have, which is the big brain. And therefore, intelligence has become our chief adaptation. And that's why Homo sapiens is arguably the most intelligent known living animal. Now, I've mentioned in here before, I mentioned it a while back, that brain size in and of itself is not an indicator of intelligence. I cannot weigh your brain versus my brain and decide who's smarter based on who's got a bigger brain. What is a really good indicator of intelligence is what we call the cephalic index. CEPHALIC A-L-I-C, cephalic, prefix ceph, C-E-P-H again. Cephalic index basically is the ratio of brain to body. That is, how much brain do you have per unit of body mass? You will find that in general, the higher an animal's cephalic index, the more intelligent it tends to be. And you can plot a graph of this, and you can find that in general, intelligence rises with, and brain complexity rises with that. You know, as cephalic index gets higher, you're going to find the animal has a higher and higher degree of complex ways of interacting with the world around it, more complex behaviors, more socialization, and so forth. It's almost a perfect predictor. At the bottom end of that spectrum, I told you guys, I think a while back, think back to the extinct dinosaurs. Stegosaurus, your good old buddy with the plates along his back and the spiky tail. Stegosaurus has the dubious distinction of having one of the lowest cephalic indexes of any animal we have documented, extinct or living. That multi-ton animal was powered by a brain about the size of a walnut. By the numbers, it's one of the stupidest animals that has ever lived. Now, let's contrast that with ourselves. Homo sapiens. Although your brain itself is smaller than the brain of, say, a whale, or smaller than the brain of an elephant, gram for gram, you have more brain mass per unit of body mass than any other living animal. Homo sapiens has the highest cephalic index of any living animal, and that very definitively correlates with our intelligence. We have very complex brains. Surface area is part of this as well. It's not just mass of brain, it's brain surface area. Take a brain. It's all folded, right? You look at a human brain, it's got all those creases and folds all over its surface. Your brain is extensively folded because that increases the surface area. It's like adding processor space to a computer. More surface area for processing, you can do more computations. If your brain is smoother, it has less folds, less crenellations, less surface area. And it cannot do as much cognitive activity as an equivalently sized brain of greater complexity. Your brain versus orangutan brain. Orangutan brains are nowhere near as folded as ours are, so even though your body is considerably smaller than that of an adult orangutan, you have much more brain power than it does. You've got about 3 times as much surface area in its brain as the orang has. More surface area, incidentally, tends to coordinate to greater density, and therefore more mass of brain. But yeah, Homo sapiens, highest cephalic index, more brain-to-body ratio of any living animal. It is completely unsurprising that we are the animals with the most complex cognitive processing systems known, and animals for whom our chief adaptation has been that big fancy brain. All right, sounding good? So considering all of that, it doesn't pay for a sheep to be smart. The sheep's environment is not making a lot of demands of it. Sheep socialization is simple. Sheep environment does not offer a lot of demands. Sheep diet does not require a lot of information either. The sheep doesn't need to be smart. A big brain in the sheep would quite simply be a waste of nutrients and a waste of calories. Sheep have a hard time getting fats and proteins in their largely vegetarian diets anyway. Brains consume a lot of those things. It's a waste of good nutrients. And of course, low caloric density in the grasses and things they're eating. Sheep are not pulling in as many calories at a time as an animal that's got a more omnivorous or carnivorous diet. So it's harder to maintain that. And they just don't need the processing power. So all in all, having a big brain would be an evolutionary disadvantage to the sheep. For its lifestyle and its environment, it quite simply does not need that drain of its resources. For you, it's cost effective. And it's still the most costly thing in your body. By the way, if I didn't say so before, really interesting detail about this, that we do not have the highest cephalic index of any animal that has ever lived. I might have mentioned this earlier in the semester, but the title for highest cephalic index, highest brain-to-body ratio, goes to one of our evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis, or Homo sapiens neanderthalensis is probably a better description. The Neanderthals were not our ancestors, they were our cousins. Our last common ancestor with Neanderthal probably goes back between 700 and 900,000 years. We branched from them a long time ago. They lived alongside Homo sapiens, and increasing evidence suggests we interbred with them. But here's the thing. Neanderthal had a higher cephalic index than we do. Homo sapiens, your brain as on average between 1,350 and 1,550 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals' brains got between 1,600 and 1,800 cubic centimeters. They had a larger brain relative to body size than we did, and their body size was not that much greater than ours. Their cephalic index was higher. So by the numbers, Neanderthals had more brain per unit of body mass than you do. And in some respects, they were probably smarter than we are. Now, you think grunting, stupid Neanderthals, that is an old stereotype that is not borne out by the evidence. The archaeological record suggests that Neanderthals had complex culture, that they took care of their sick. We have found skeletons of Neanderthals with severe injuries where they clearly could not have cared for themselves, but somebody was clearly feeding them and helping them. We know that they built complex tools. We know that they produced art. We know that they buried their dead and therefore seemed to have a spiritual life of some kind. So Neanderthals were no intellectual slouches. Now, there is evidence to suggest that not all their development was in the same regions of the brain as we have. And if you look at the endocast, the model of the Neanderthal brain taken from the inside of the skull, it appears that they had less development in the regions of the forebrain involved in linguistic and symbolic processing. Therefore, it is quite probable that although they were intelligent, they may not have had as sophisticated a system for symbolic thinking as we do. Or to put it another way, their language may not have been as complex as ours. And therefore, they may not have communicated cultural innovations as rapidly as we do. If you look at the archaeological record, you'll see that Neanderthal toolkits barely change for tens of thousands of years, whereas Homo sapiens innovates its stone tools every couple of thousands of years to make better ones. We, in other words, seemed to adapt culturally faster, and that suggests something was going on in our brains cognitively that was giving us an edge over them, even though their specific cephalic index was higher. They may have been better at certain kinds of thinking than we do. We suggest looking at their brains, they were probably better at visuospatial processing. A Neanderthal was probably way better at estimating where to throw a spear than you are, but maybe not quite so good at figuring out a better way to build a more efficient spear. It's not to say they're stupid, not to say that they're dumb, not to say that they were grunting and had no language. They had a hyoid bone, the bone in the throat that anchors the vocal cords. They had a language. We don't know that their language was simpler than ours, but we do know that they were certainly no slouches in the brain department, and in some respects, they may have been our superiors. So that's where we're at with all of that. Sounding good? Okay. So this is kind of giving you all an introduction to basically evolution of nervous systems, what kind of nervous structures you can expect to find in various species, and why some species benefit from a more complex nervous system than others. I should point out another thing, that even though your brain may be better than that of certain animals in terms of the kind of things we're good at, there are animals that are way better at certain activities than we are because they have better neurological capacity for those things. Cats, for example, have tracts of tissue within their spinal cord that are way better at coordinating their bodily movements than you are. Cats are way more agile than we are, much better at jumping, climbing, and maneuvering their bodies in complicated ways. So are monkeys. There are a lot of animals that are way more dexterous than humans, way more agile, way more capable of coordinating bodily movements than we are. Those animals are cognitively our superiors when it comes to the kinds of processing that involve the movements of their bodies. So even when we talk about intelligence, we must consider that intelligence is more than one thing. What we think of as intelligence, cognitive processing, learning, memory, and so forth, is only one of many activities that a nervous system can engage in. And there's good reason to believe that when it comes to other activities, such as coordinating bodily movements or processing certain kinds of sensory data, that we, when it comes to those areas of cognition, are dumber than a lot of animals. When it comes to hand-eye coordination, or I guess I should say more to the point, muscular coordination overall, your cat is your superior. When it comes to interpreting scent data, your dog is way better than you because they have much more brain space dedicated to olfactory processing, sense of smell, than you do. And as such, they can get far more information out of sniffing something than you get out of it. In that regard, they are your intellectual superior. Lots of kinds of cognition, depending on what you need to be doing. All right, so that, I think, gives us a decent picture of the fundamentals of nervous system structure and evolution. You now have a basic idea of how we got the nervous systems that we got and why some animals have more complex or less complex nervous systems than others in general, and why they might be better or worse in specific domains of competence. Why some animals might be better socializers than others, or better climbers than others, or better smellers than others, or better tool makers than others. And why some animals just might not benefit from being all that smart at all. All right, I think this is a good point to leave off. In our next lesson, we're going to begin talking a little bit more about nervous system structure and function. Our focus is going to be on centralized nervous systems, the complex nervous system that you and I possess. We're going to talk about basically how brains take in data, process that data, and send out instructions. That's going to be the thrust of our next discussion. I hope you've all enjoyed this. I hope you all have a good evening. Talk to you all later.